In an age where power was forged in iron and authority belonged almost exclusively to men, there emerged a figure so unexpected that her very existence disrupted the foundation of an entire system. And her name was Deborah, a woman who did not rise through rebellion, inheritance, or force, but through something far more dangerous and enduring: clarity, presence, and an authority that people chose to follow. And that is where this story truly begins, not on a battlefield filled with noise and chaos, but in a quiet, almost unremarkable place beneath a palm tree, where decisions were made that would one day shake an empire. Because long before armies gathered and swords were drawn, Deborah was already shaping the future of a nation that didn't even realize how close it was to collapse. And if you pause for a moment and imagine the tension of that time, you begin to understand just how unlikely her rise truly was. Because Israel was not unified, not stable, not strong, but fractured into tribes that barely functioned together, each one surviving on its own instincts while a greater force tightened its grip around them. And that force came under the rule of King Jabin, whose control was not just political, but psychological, reinforced by a terrifying military advantage that seemed almost impossible to overcome: 900 iron chariots. Machines of war that didn't just defeat enemies, but crushed their will before battle even began. And in a world like that, resistance doesn't just fade. It disappears. It becomes something people whisper about rather than act upon. And over 20 years of oppression had taught the people one simple lesson: survival was safer than defiance. And yet in the middle of that silence, in the middle of that fear, people began to gather under a palm tree, not because they were commanded to, not because they were forced, but because they believed that something there was different, something there was real, and that something was Deborah, who did not sit on a throne or hide behind guards, but positioned herself in a place where anyone could approach her, where disputes were settled openly, where justice was not distant but accessible. And in doing so, she quietly dismantled one of the most powerful assumptions of her time: that authority must be hidden, controlled, and distant to be effective. Because Deborah did the opposite. She made leadership visible. She made it personal, and that alone made her dangerous. Not in the way armies are dangerous, but in the way ideas are dangerous. Because ideas spread, they reshape perception, they rebuild identity. And that is exactly what she was doing without anyone fully realizing it yet. Because while others were preparing for war with weapons, Deborah was preparing for war in the minds of the people, restoring something that had been eroded over years of oppression, the belief that change was still possible. And this is where the story deepens, because revolutions rarely begin with force. They begin with a shift in thinking, a moment where fear is no longer the dominant voice. And under that palm tree, Deborah became the catalyst for that shift, listening, guiding, judging, but also subtly reconstructing the confidence of an entire nation. And here is where you begin to see that her position was not a limitation, but a strategy. Because while kings ruled from fortresses and generals commanded from the front lines, Deborah ruled from a place of connection, where trust was built daily, where influence was not demanded but earned. And that kind of authority is far more powerful than anything imposed by force. because it cannot be easily broken. And yet even that kind of leadership eventually reaches a moment where words are no longer enough, where vision must transform into action. And that moment was approaching faster than anyone expected. Because the longer the people remained passive, the stronger their enemy became. The oppression was not static. It was tightening, expanding, reinforcing itself with every year that passed. And eventually the question was no longer whether something needed to be done, but who would dare to do it. And that is when Deborah's role began to shift from a judge who resolved conflict to a leader who would initiate it. Because clarity, when taken seriously, always leads to confrontation, and Deborah understood that better than anyone. She knew that the time for quiet guidance was coming to an end, and the time for decisive action had arrived. But what makes this moment so powerful is not just what she decided to do, but how she chose to do it. Because she did not gather an army herself. She did not attempt to become something she was not. Instead, she demonstrated a different kind of strength. The ability to recognize exactly who was needed for the next step. And she called for Barak, a military leader who would become central to what followed. And this decision reveals something critical about Deborah's leadership. She did not need to control every part of the process. To remain in authority, she understood delegation not as a weakness, but as a strategy. Because true leadership is not about doing everything. It is about aligning the right people at the right time under a shared vision. And yet what happened next introduced a tension that makes this story unforgettable. Because when Barak received the call, when he was presented with the opportunity to lead an army against overwhelming odds, he hesitated, not out of cowardice, but out of something far more complex. He refused to go unless Deborah went with him. And this moment changes everything, because it reveals that Deborah's influence extended far beyond guidance. She was not just respected, she was essential. Her presence carried something that could not be replaced. Something that even a trained military leader recognized he could not do without. And this forces us to ask a deeper question. What kind of authority creates that level of dependence? What kind of leader makes warriors unwilling to move forward unless she stands beside them? And the answer lies in something rare, something that cannot be manufactured quickly. It is the alignment of trust, vision, and conviction. Deborah was not just giving orders. She embodied the certainty behind them. And without that certainty, even the strongest plans begin to feel unstable. And her response to Barak's condition was just as decisive as everything she had done before. She agreed to go, but she made it clear that this decision would come with a consequence. The victory they were about to pursue would not bring glory to Barak. Instead, it would be credited to a woman, and with that statement, the narrative shifts once again. Because now the story is no longer just about survival or resistance. It becomes the complete reversal of expectations. A system built on assumptions about power and gender is about to be overturned from within. And what makes this even more compelling is that at this point, no one fully understands how that prophecy will unfold. It hangs in the air as both a promise and a mystery, setting the stage for events that will defy conventional logic. And all of it traces back to that simple yet profound image of a woman sitting under a palm tree, not commanding attention, not demanding recognition, but quietly building the foundation for a transformation that would ripple through history. Because before the battle ever begins, before strategies are tested and enemies confronted, the most important shift has already taken place. A people who once accepted oppression have begun to believe in the possibility of freedom. And that belief, fragile as it may seem, is more powerful than any iron chariot. Because it changes how people move, how they decide, how they act when the moment finally arrives. And that moment is now closer than ever, because the call has been made. The leader has been chosen, and the prophecy has been spoken. And what comes next will not just determine the outcome of a battle, but will redefine what leadership looks like in a world that never expected someone like Deborah to rise. And as the tension builds, and the pieces begin to align, one thing becomes undeniable. This story is not following the rules anyone thought were unbreakable. And when the clash finally comes, it will not be decided by strength alone, but by something far more unpredictable. Something that has been quietly growing all along beneath the surface, waiting for the exact moment to emerge and change everything. The moment a nation decides to rise is never as loud as you expect. It doesn't begin with the clash of weapons or the roar of armies. It begins in a quiet but irreversible shift. The decision to act despite fear, and as Deborah stood no longer just beneath her palm tree, but now, at the edge of something far more dangerous, the call to war was no longer an idea. It was reality, and the man chosen to lead it, Barak, stood at the center of a tension that would define everything that followed. Because this was not a battle built on confidence. It was a confrontation shaped by hesitation, by doubt, by the overwhelming awareness that 900 iron chariots did not fall easily. And yet what makes this moment so compelling is not the scale of the enemy, but the condition that Barak placed before moving forward. A condition that would expose the true power dynamic at play. Because he did not refuse the mission, he did not reject the calling. Instead, he drew a line that revealed something deeper than fear. He said he would only go if Deborah went with him. And that single statement carries more weight than it first appears, because in a world where military authority was supposed to stand on its own, Barak's insistence exposed a truth that no system could easily explain. That Deborah's presence was not symbolic. It was essential. And that raises a question that cuts straight to the core of leadership itself. What does it mean when the one who commands armies refuses to move without the one who never trained as a soldier? What kind of authority transcends experience, rank, and expectations so completely that even a general will not act without it? And the answer lies in something far more powerful than strategy alone, because Deborah was not just issuing commands. She carried conviction. She embodied certainty in a way that made hesitation feel impossible when she was near. And without that certainty, even the strongest leaders falter. And this is where the story tightens. Because Deborah does not respond with reassurance. She does not comfort Barak or attempt to strengthen his confidence in conventional ways. Instead, she agrees. But her agreement comes with a declaration that shifts the entire meaning of what is about to happen. She tells him that the honor of the victory will not belong to him, that it will be given into the hands of a woman, and with that, the narrative fractures away from everything expected. Because this is no longer just about defeating an enemy. It becomes about redefining who gets remembered, who holds the final power, who shapes the outcome in ways that no one anticipates. And as this prophecy hangs in the air, unresolved and mysterious, it creates a tension that follows every step they take toward the battlefield. Because now every movement carries a question. Where will this promise be fulfilled? How will it unfold? And who will ultimately embody it? And yet there is no time to linger on uncertainty. Because the call to arms has been made, and the tribes begin to respond, not all of them, not fully united, but enough to form something that had not existed for a long time. A collective willingness to fight back, and that alone signals a shift that cannot be reversed. Because once people choose resistance, even imperfectly, the structure of oppression begins to weaken. And here is where Deborah's influence becomes even more evident. Because this army is not built on dominance, it is built on belief, fragile but powerful. And as they gather, the contrast between what they are and what they face becomes almost overwhelming. Because across the land stands Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, a man who does not question victory, who commands a force designed to crush opposition before it can organize, and his 900 iron chariots are not just tools of war. They are symbols of inevitability, machines that have reinforced the idea that resistance is futile for 2 decades, and yet now, for the first time, that inevitability is being challenged, not by superior force, but by a decision that seems almost irrational, to stand and fight anyway. And this is where the deeper psychological battle unfolds. Because Sisera's strength is not just physical, it is rooted in the assumption that no one will dare oppose him. And Deborah's strategy begins by breaking that assumption, by creating a situation that forces confrontation on new terms, and as Barak prepares to move, still carrying the weight of his dependence on Deborah's presence, the army begins its march toward Mount Tabor, a decision that at first glance might seem purely logistical, but in reality, it reveals a level of strategic thinking that most would overlook. Because terrain matters, and Deborah understands that better than anyone. She knows that the strength of iron chariots lies in open, flat ground, where speed and momentum can be fully unleashed. But Mount Tabor is not that kind of terrain. It rises, it disrupts, it forces movement to slow, to adjust, to lose its natural advantage. And in choosing that location, Deborah is not just positioning an army. She is reshaping the battlefield itself, turning the enemy's greatest strength into a potential weakness. And this is where the tension sharpens again, because strategy alone does not guarantee success, especially when the imbalance of power is so extreme. And as Sisera receives word of the gathering forces, he does exactly what is expected. He mobilizes, confident, unshaken, bringing his full force toward the confrontation. Because from his perspective, this is not a threat. It is an opportunity to reinforce control, to crush the idea of resistance before it spreads any further. And as the two sides move closer, the atmosphere thickens with anticipation, because something unprecedented is about to happen. And yet even now, the outcome is far from certain, because belief must now face reality. Conviction must meet force. And the question that lingers beneath everything is whether faith and strategy together can overcome what seems mechanically unstoppable. And then, in the middle of this rising tension, Deborah speaks again, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with a clarity that cuts through every uncertainty. She tells Barak that the moment has arrived, that this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into his hands. And this declaration does more than signal the start of battle. It transforms the perception of it. Because now the fight is not framed as a desperate attempt to survive, but as a decisive moment already determined. And that shift in perspective changes everything. Because when people believe the outcome is already secured, they move differently. They act with a boldness that would otherwise be impossible. And Barak, hearing this, finally moves, descending from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men behind him, stepping into a confrontation that will either confirm everything Deborah has declared, or shatter it completely. And this is where the story reaches a critical turning point. Because as the armies collide, something unexpected begins to unfold. Something that no strategy alone could guarantee. Something that shifts the balance in a way that transforms the impossible into reality. And just as the chariots begin to advance, just as their power should dominate the battlefield, the conditions begin to change. The ground softens. The stability they rely on begins to falter. And what once moved with unstoppable force starts to lose its edge. And in that moment, the advantage begins to slip, not gradually, but decisively. Because the very thing that made Sisera's army invincible is now working against him. And the chaos that follows is not just physical, it is psychological. Because when certainty collapses, so does control. And suddenly the battle is no longer predictable. It is no longer one-sided. It becomes something entirely different. A fight where the outcome is no longer dictated by technology, but by adaptability, by timing, by the ability to act in a moment that no one could have fully planned for. And as the tide turns, as the army of Israel begins to push forward, something becomes undeniably clear. This is not unfolding according to the expectations of the powerful. It is unfolding according to a design that was set in motion long before the first soldier moved. And at the center of it all stands Deborah, not as a warrior on the front lines, but as the one who saw it coming, who understood that victory would not come from matching strength with strength, but from redefining the conditions of the battle itself. And as Sisera's forces begin to break, as the unthinkable starts to take shape, the prophecy spoken earlier begins to move closer to fulfillment, because the victory, as promised, is slipping away from the hands that expected to claim it, and moving towards something far more unexpected, something that will not only end the battle, but will redefine how it is remembered. And as the dust rises, and the sound of collapsing chariots fills the air, one truth emerges with undeniable force. The impossible is no longer impossible, and the story is far from over. Because the final act of this victory is still waiting to unfold, and when it does, it will come from a place no one thought to look, carried out by someone no one expected, completing a chain of events that began not with power, but with a woman who dared to see beyond it. The collapse of an army does not always end with the final clash of weapons. Sometimes it begins in the exact moment when certainty disappears, and as Sisera watched his advantage dissolve into chaos, the battlefield that once guaranteed his dominance became the very thing that stripped it away. Because the chariots that defined his power were no longer moving with precision, they were sinking, stalling, turning from instruments of control into obstacles of survival. And in that instant, something far more dangerous than defeat took hold: disorientation. The kind that spreads faster than fear, because it breaks the illusion of inevitability. And when an army built on superiority begins to question its own invincibility, the outcome is no longer measured by strength, but by who can adapt faster to the unexpected. And this is where everything unravels, because Barak's forces, once outmatched, now surged forward with a momentum that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with timing. Because they were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting from a position of rising certainty, the exact opposite of what Sisera's army was experiencing. And in the middle of that reversal, Sisera made a decision that would define the rest of his story. He abandoned his chariot, stepped down from the symbol of his power, and fled on foot. And this moment is more significant than it first appears, because a commander leaving his chariot is not just a tactical retreat. It is the visible collapse of control. It is the admission, whether spoken or not, that the structure he relied on can no longer protect him. And as he ran, the battlefield behind him transformed from a place of command into a place of pursuit. Because Barak did not stop, his forces did not pause to celebrate the turning tide. They pressed forward, chasing down what remained of an army that had already lost its cohesion. And one by one, the forces of Sisera fell, not in organized resistance, but in scattered retreat, until the reality became undeniable. There was no recovery, no regrouping, no second wave, only collapse. And yet even in that moment of overwhelming defeat, the story refuses to end in a predictable way, because Sisera, the man who commanded 900 iron chariots, the man who held a nation under oppression for 2 decades, was still alive, still moving, still searching for a way to escape the consequences of a battle that had already been lost. And this is where the narrative shifts once again, away from armies, and into something far more intimate. Because the final act of this story will not be decided on a battlefield. It will unfold in a place that appears safe, ordinary, even welcoming. And that contrast is what makes it so powerful. Because as Sisera fled, he arrived at the tent of a woman named Yael. And at first glance, this encounter seems almost accidental, almost disconnected from the larger conflict. But in reality, it is the exact point where Deborah's earlier prophecy begins to close its circle, because long before this moment, the declaration had been made that the honor of victory would belong to a woman. And now, as Sisera steps into Yael's space, exhausted, vulnerable, and unaware, the conditions for that prophecy to be fulfilled are aligning with a precision that no one on the battlefield could have orchestrated. And here is where the tension tightens in a completely different way. Because Yael does not meet Sisera with hostility, she does not reveal danger. Instead, she offers something entirely unexpected: hospitality. She invites him in, reassures him, covers him, gives him milk when he asks for water, and in doing so, she creates a moment of complete psychological disarmament, because Sisera, who has spent years operating in a world of power and control, now believes he has found refuge, a place where the rules of war no longer apply, and that belief is what allows him to let his guard down completely. And this is where the story becomes almost unsettling in its precision. Because Yael is not reacting impulsively, she is acting with a clarity that mirrors Deborah's earlier decisions. A clarity that understands the weight of the moment and the opportunity it presents. And as Sisera falls into a deep sleep, convinced that he has escaped, convinced that he is safe, the final movement begins, and it is quiet, almost silent compared to the chaos of the battlefield. But its impact is far greater, because Yael takes a tent peg and a hammer, tools of her environment, not weapons of war, and she steps into a role that no one would have assigned to her, a role that fulfills a prophecy spoken long before she ever appeared in the story. And in a single, decisive act, she brings an end to the man who once commanded an unstoppable force. And what makes this moment so powerful is not just the act itself, but what it represents, because it completes a narrative that has been building from the very beginning. A narrative that overturns expectations at every level. Because the defeat of Sisera does not come from a rival general. It does not come from a stronger army. It comes through the actions of a woman operating outside the structures that defined power in that world. And when Barak finally arrives, still in pursuit, he is not met with a battle. He is met with a conclusion. Yael shows him what has already been done, and in that moment, Deborah's prophecy is fully realized, not symbolically, but literally. The victory does not belong to the one who led the charge. It belongs to the one who completed it. And this is where the story reveals its deepest layer, because it is not just about who wins. It is about how victory is defined, because everything about this outcome challenges the assumptions that shaped the conflict in the first place. The strongest army did not prevail. The most advanced technology did not secure control. The expected heroes did not claim the final moment. Instead, the entire structure of power was dismantled through a sequence of decisions that relied on insight, timing, and the willingness to act when the opportunity appeared. And as the reality of Sisera's defeat spreads, the impact reaches far beyond the battlefield, because this is not just the end of a commander. It is the collapse of an entire system of oppression. King Jabin's control begins to weaken, not instantly, but inevitably, because the foundation it relied on has been broken, and over time, that control is completely dismantled, leading to something that had not existed for years: peace. Not temporary, not fragile, but sustained, lasting for 40 years, and that duration matters. Because it is not just a pause between conflicts, it is a generation shaped by stability, a period where the memory of oppression is replaced by the experience of freedom. And at the center of that transformation stands Deborah, not as a distant figure, but as the one who initiated the shift, who saw beyond the immediate fear and into the possibility of something different. And yet the story does not end with silence. It ends with a voice. Because Deborah does something that ensures this moment will not be forgotten. She sings, and What she creates is not just a celebration, it is a record, a declaration, a piece of history that captures not only what happened, but why it mattered. Often referred to as the Song of Deborah, it stands as one of the oldest surviving pieces of heroic poetry, and within it, the events of this story are preserved with a clarity that goes beyond simple narration. It highlights the courage of those who stepped forward. It acknowledges the hesitation of those who did not. It elevates the roles of women who reshaped the outcome. And it frames the entire conflict not as a random victory, but as a moment of alignment between action and purpose. And this is where the story extends beyond its own time, because what Deborah accomplished was not limited to a single battle or a single generation. It established a model of leadership that continues to resonate. A model that does not rely on traditional power structures, but redefines them. That does not wait for permission, but acts with conviction. That does not conform to expectation, but transforms it. And in a world that continues to wrestle with questions of authority, representation, and courage, her story remains strikingly relevant. Because it reminds us that leadership is not determined by position, but by vision. Not by strength alone, but by the ability to see what others cannot and to act on it when it matters most. And as you step back and look at the entire arc of what has unfolded, from a woman sitting under a palm tree to the collapse of an oppressive empire, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The most powerful shifts in history often begin in the places no one is paying attention to, carried forward by people no one expects, until the moment arrives when everything changes, and by then it is already too late to stop it. What happens after a victory is often more revealing than the battle itself. Because triumph can fade, momentum can fracture, and even the most decisive wins can dissolve into silence if no one understands how to carry them forward. But in this story, something entirely different unfolds. Because the end of Sisera was not just the fall of a commander, it was the breaking point of an entire system. And as the dust settled, and the echoes of battle faded, a new reality began to take shape, one that had not existed for decades. And yet here is the question that changes everything. How do you transform a moment of victory into a generation of peace? Because defeating an enemy is one thing, but reshaping the future is something else entirely. And this is where Deborah's leadership reaches its most profound expression, not in war, but in what comes after it. Because while most leaders are remembered for how they fight, Deborah is remembered for how she secured what followed. And the answer begins in something that might seem unexpected, something that carries more power than weapons or strategy or song. Because instead of allowing the story to scatter into fragmented memory, Deborah gives it form. She captures it, defines it, and ensures that it will not be forgotten. And this is not just poetry. This is preservation. This is narrative control at its highest level. Because the way a story is told determines how it is remembered. And the way it is remembered determines how it shapes the future. And in what is now known as the Song of Deborah, she does something remarkable. She turns a military victory into a cultural foundation. She names the tribes who showed up. She calls out those who did not. She elevates the courage that made the impossible possible. And she places the entire event within A framework that goes beyond human effort, connecting it to purpose, to meaning, to something larger than the battle itself. And this is where the story gains a new kind of power. Because it is no longer just an account of what happened. It becomes a lens through which future generations will understand themselves. And here is the deeper hook: history is not shaped only by events. It is shaped by who defines them, and Deborah ensures that this moment is defined with clarity, with intention, with a focus that reinforces the values that made it possible. And as that narrative spreads, as it is repeated, remembered, and internalized, it begins to do something even more significant. It stabilizes the victory. It prevents the return of fear. Because people are no longer just aware that they won, they understand why they won. And that understanding creates resilience. It creates a foundation that cannot easily be shaken. And this is how a battle becomes a turning point, or rather than a temporary success. Because without that kind of clarity, even the greatest victories can fade into confusion. But Deborah does not allow that to happen. She anchors the moment in meaning, and in doing so, she extends its impact far beyond the battlefield. And this is where the next transformation begins. Because with the oppressive system dismantled, with King Jabin's control broken and unable to recover, the land enters a period that had once seemed impossible: peace. Not short-lived, not fragile, but sustained, lasting for 40 years. And that duration is not just a detail, it is a statement. Because it reflects a stability that does not come from chance. It comes from leadership that understands how to transition from conflict to order, from resistance to structure. And this is where Deborah's influence becomes even more extraordinary. Because she does not disappear after the victory, she continues to guide, to judge, to maintain the balance that allows that peace to endure. And here is where the story speaks directly into the present. Because in a world that often celebrates the moment of breakthrough, but struggles to sustain it, Deborah's example offers something rare, a model of leadership that does not stop at success, but builds systems that protect it. And this raises a question that resonates even now: what does it take to create lasting impact in a world that constantly shifts? And the answer is woven into everything Deborah did, because she combined vision with action, strategy with timing, authority with accessibility, and perhaps most importantly, she understood that leadership is not about fitting into existing structures. It is about redefining them when they no longer serve their purpose. And that is exactly what she did. In a time when women were not expected to lead armies or shape national outcomes, she did both, not by forcing acceptance, but by demonstrating effectiveness, by proving through results. That authority is not limited by expectation, and that is why her story continues to resonate. Because it does not just challenge the norms of her time, it challenges the assumptions of every generation that hears it. And as we bring this story into the present, into a world that still wrestles with questions of leadership, representation, and power, the parallels become impossible to ignore, because the barriers may look different. The systems may be more complex, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. People still hesitate in the face of overwhelming odds, still question whether they are the right ones to step forward, still look for certainty before they act. And Deborah's story cuts through all of that with a clarity that feels almost unsettling. Because it shows that change does not begin when conditions are perfect. It begins when someone decides to move despite imperfection, and that decision, once made, has the power to reshape everything that follows. And here is the final hook. The one that lingers long after the story ends. What of the thing that changes your life? Your situation, your entire trajectory, is not the removal of obstacles, but the decision to act in the middle of them. Because that is what Deborah did. She did not wait for the iron chariots to disappear. She did not wait for the system to become fair. She stepped into a reality that was stacked against her and reshaped it from within. And in doing so, she left behind something far more valuable than a single victory. She left a blueprint, a way of thinking, a demonstration of what becomes possible when clarity, courage, and conviction align at the exact moment they are needed most. And as the story closes, as the land rests in a peace that once seemed unreachable, one truth remains, quiet but undeniable. The most powerful leaders are not always the ones who fit the expected mold. They are the ones who see beyond it, who act when others hesitate, and who understand that real change is not just about winning a battle, but about transforming what comes after it. And that is the legacy Deborah leaves behind, not just as a judge, not just as a prophet, but as a force that redefined what leadership could be, and in doing so, changed the course of history in a way that still echoes today. And yet the most dangerous part of a story like this is not the battle, not the tension, not even the impossible victory. It's what happens when you realize it was never just about them. Because the moment you see Deborah not as a distant figure in an ancient world, but as a pattern, as a blueprint, the distance between her reality and yours begins to collapse. And that is where this story becomes unsettling in the best possible way. Because it forces a question that is far harder to ignore than 900 iron chariots. What does leadership actually look like when everything around you says you shouldn't be the one stepping forward? Because Deborah didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for a system to validate her role. She operated with a level of clarity that made validation irrelevant. And that kind of clarity is rare not because it is impossible, but because it requires something most people avoid: the willingness to act before certainty feels comfortable. And if you trace every turning point in this story, every moment where the outcome shifted, you begin to see a pattern emerging. Deborah didn't control everything. She didn't eliminate risk. She didn't guarantee success in a way that removed fear. Instead, she moved anyway. And that distinction is everything. Because most people are not held back by a lack of opportunity. They are held back by the need for assurance, the need to know that the outcome will justify the action before they take it. But Deborah reversed that entirely. She acted in a way that created the outcome. And this is where the story shifts from inspiration into something far more practical, because it stops being about admiration and starts becoming about application. And that transition is uncomfortable, because it removes the distance that allows us to say that was her, not me, and replaces it with something far more directive. The same conditions appeared in your life. Would you recognize them? And more importantly, would you move? Because the reality is, Most defining moments do not look dramatic when they first appear. They look like uncertainty, like risk, like situations where the odds feel misaligned. And that is exactly how Deborah's story began, not with a clear path, but with a fractured nation, an overwhelming enemy, and a role that did not fit the expectations placed on her. And yet she did not interpret those conditions as a reason to step back. She interpreted them as the exact reason to step forward. And this is where the deeper lesson begins to take shape. Because leadership is not about stepping into a position. It is about stepping into responsibility before the position even exists. And Deborah embodied that long before anyone labeled her a judge or a leader. She acted as one before she was recognized as one, and that sequence matters. Because it means the identity followed the action, not the other way around. And when you understand that, it changes how you see your own potential influence. Because it suggests that the limitation is not external structure, but internal hesitation. And that is a far more difficult barrier to confront, because it cannot be blamed on circumstances. It must be addressed directly. And here is where the story becomes almost confrontational, because it challenges the idea that power must come from status, from title, from recognition. Deborah had none of those in the beginning. What she had was alignment between what she saw and what she was willing to do about it. And that alignment is what gave her authority, not the system around her. And as you look back at the sequence of events, from the palm tree to the battlefield to the aftermath, you begin to realize that every stage required a different kind of courage. The courage to be visible when it would have been easier to remain unnoticed. The courage to speak when silence was safer. The courage to act when the outcome was uncertain. And the courage to sustain what was built after the victory had already been achieved. And most people can handle one of those moments. Maybe two. But Deborah moved through all of them. And that continuity is what made her impact lasting rather than temporary. And this is where the final layer of the story reveals itself. Because it is not just about what she did. It is about how consistently she did it. Across different contexts. Under different pressures. Without losing the clarity that guided her from the beginning. And that kind of consistency is what turns influence into legacy. Because anyone can rise in a moment, but sustaining that rise requires something deeper, something that is not dependent on circumstances. And that is exactly what we see here, a leadership that adapts without losing its core. That evolves without compromising its direction. And as the story closes, as the 40 years of peace settle into the land, it would be easy to see this as an ending, a completed narrative, a moment that belongs entirely to the past. But that would miss the most important point. Because stories like this do not exist to stay in history. They exist to reappear in different forms, in different times, in different lives. And the real question is not whether Deborah's story is remarkable. It clearly is. The real question is whether the pattern it reveals is something you are willing to recognize. When it shows up in your own life, because it will not announce itself as a grand calling, it will appear as a decision. A moment where you can either step forward or remain where you are. And in that moment, everything you have just heard becomes relevant in a way that cannot be ignored. Because now you know what is possible when someone chooses to move despite uncertainty. You know what can happen when clarity overrides hesitation. And you know that the greatest shifts do not begin with perfect conditions. They begin with imperfect decisions made at the right time. And that is where this story leaves you, not with a conclusion, but with a challenge. Because the same forces that shaped Deborah's world, fear, resistance, imbalance, expectation, still exist today, just in different forms, and the opportunity to respond to them still appears, often quietly, often unexpectedly, and when it does, the question will not be whether you are ready in the traditional sense. The question will be whether you are willing to step into something that does not yet feel certain, willing to act before the outcome is guaranteed, willing to become the kind of person who does not wait for the world to change before moving, but moves in a way that changes the world itself. And if there is one thing this story makes undeniably clear, it is that those moments matter far more than they seem when they first appear, because they are the beginning of everything that follows. And whether they become turning points or missed opportunities depends entirely on what you choose to do when they arrive. And in the end, the story of Deborah does not fade into silence, it lingers, like a question that refuses to be ignored. Because what began under a simple palm tree became something far greater than a victory over an enemy. It became proof that the boundaries people accept are often the very things that must be broken. And as the land rested in 40 years of peace, what remained was not just relief, but a legacy that continued to echo long after the battle was forgotten. A legacy built not on dominance, but on clarity, courage, and the willingness to act when no one else would. And if you step back and look at the full arc, from a divided nation living in fear, to a woman rising in a place no one expected, to an army moving against impossible odds, to a victory that defied every assumption, you begin to see that this was never just a story about war. It was a story about transformation, about what happens when someone refuses to accept the limits placed on them and instead rewrites the outcome entirely. And that is why it still matters, because the world may look different now. The battles may not be fought with chariots and swords, but the deeper struggles remain the same. The tension between fear and action, between hesitation and conviction, between waiting for change and becoming the one who creates it. And Deborah's story stands as a reminder that history does not only belong to those who hold power, it belongs to those who recognize the moment when everything can shift and have the courage to step into it. And maybe that is the final truth this story leaves behind. Not something loud or dramatic, but something quiet and unshakable. That the turning points of life rarely arrive with certainty. They arrive with choice, and in that choice lies everything. Because one decision, one step forward taken in the middle of doubt, can ripple outward in ways that reshape far more than you ever imagined. Just as it did beneath that palm tree, just as it did on that battlefield, and just as it still can today, because the story is not really over. It simply waits for the next person willing to answer the same call.